The morning sun was barely peeking over the rooftops when Jaden Woods heard a loud knock on his front door. Groggy and still half asleep, he shuffled down the hallway, rubbing his eyes. But as he reached the door and peeked through the blinds, his heart stopped. 2 police officers were standing outside with stern expressions. Behind them, his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Fields, looked back at him with an expression that was both fearful and accusing. Jaden froze, his thoughts racing.
What's going on?
He whispered to himself, glancing over his shoulder, wondering if he should wake his mom. But before he could act, another loud knock brought him back to reality. Reluctantly, he opened the door, his throat dry and his pulse racing.
Jaden Woods?
The taller officer asked, his tone formal and unyielding.
Yes, sir, that's me.
Jaden replied, his voice trembling as anxiety tightened in his chest. The second officer gave Mrs. Fields a quick glance before focusing back on Jaden.
Would you mind if we asked you a few questions?
He asked with a serious expression. Jaden's confusion grew.
Questions? What's this about?
He stammered, barely able to form words. Mrs. Fields shifted, looking away briefly. Her expression was anxious and troubled, a stark contrast to the grateful smile she'd worn just yesterday.
Jaden, I'm sorry about this.
She began, her voice unsteady.
But I just don't feel safe. I need to know what happened yesterday.
Jaden felt as though he'd been punched in the gut. He hadn't done anything wrong. Just yesterday, he'd gone over to Mrs. Fields' house to help her fix her television. The screen had gone black during her favorite show, and since she was too frail to troubleshoot it herself, he'd offered to help. Now his stomach twisted as her words sank in. Trying to steady his voice, he spoke defensively.
I don't understand, Mrs. Fields. I just came over to help with your TV, that's all.
The first officer's gaze hardened.
We need you to tell us exactly what happened yesterday. In detail,
he said, his tone sharp. The officer's serious expressions and Mrs. Fields' nervous gaze filled Jaden with panic. This wasn't a friendly visit. This was an interrogation.
I just fixed the TV,
he replied, his voice shaking.
It wasn't working, and I thought I could help. Mrs. Fields, you remember, I was only there for maybe 10 minutes.
Mrs. Fields avoided his eyes, wringing her hands.
Yes, but after you left, I felt strange,
she said softly, her voice filled with unease.
I think I blacked out. And when I woke up, things felt wrong in the house.
One of the officers turned to her.
Mrs. Fields, could you describe what felt wrong? Did you notice anything missing?
He asked gently. Mrs. Fields nodded slowly, her hands trembling as she spoke.
Some of my valuables, a gold necklace, a few pieces of jewelry, gone. I don't understand how it happened. And, well, Jaden was the only one who came by.
The officers exchanged a look and turned back to Jaden, their expressions unreadable yet firm.
Jaden, we'll need you to come down to the station with us to answer a few more questions,
the officer said, his tone leaving no room for argument.
Wait, are you saying you think I stole from her?
Jaden's voice rose, a mix of hurt and disbelief.
I swear I didn't touch anything. I just fixed the TV and left.
Just then, his mother, Linda, appeared behind him, her face filled with anger and concern.
What's going on here? Why are you accusing my son?
She demanded, her tone protective and fierce. One of the officers tried to placate her.
Ma'am, we just need to clarify some details. There's no need to worry.
Linda's eyes flashed with anger.
No need to worry? You show up here accusing my son of stealing from an elderly woman he only tried to help? This is ridiculous.
The officers exchanged a cautious look, unprepared for Linda's fierce defense, but their expressions remained steady.
Mrs. Woods, we're just doing our job,
the second officer replied calmly.
If Jaden has nothing to hide, this won't take long.
Linda looked down at Jaden, her resolve firm.
Fine, but I'm coming with him,
she said, a hint of steel in her voice. At the police station, Jaden sat across from the officers in a cold, sterile room. The interrogation light flickered above, casting shadows along the walls. Linda sat beside him, her jaw clenched, her face a mask of anger. One officer began, his voice firm but neutral.
Now, Jaden, we're going to go over what happened yesterday in Mrs. Fields' home. We need every detail.
Jaden's frustration bubbled over.
I told you already, her TV was acting up. She asked if I could look at it. I did, and I left. I didn't even go further than her living room.
And you're sure you didn't see anything unusual? Or take anything that wasn't yours?
I didn't take anything. I'd never steal from anyone.
Jaden's eyes widened with anger. He exclaimed, his voice sharp. The officers exchanged a doubtful glance, their silence implying disbelief. The first officer finally spoke, his voice measured.
Mrs. Fields says she doesn't remember much after you left. She claims to have blacked out. Can you explain that?
Jaden clenched his fists, a wave of helpless frustration washing over him. No matter what he said, they seemed set on doubting him. Linda, who had been silent, suddenly interjected, her voice firm.
My son is not a thief. If Mrs. Fields lost her memory, maybe it's due to her age. She's in her 80s for crying out loud.
The officers didn't seem swayed by her argument, their expressions impassive. The second officer looked at Jaden, his face expressionless.
Until we have more information, Jaden, you're officially a suspect in this case.
Jaden's stomach twisted painfully. A suspect? He'd only tried to help, and now they were treating him like a criminal. Back at home, Linda could barely contain her fury as they stepped inside. Jaden slumped onto the couch, feeling the weight of suspicion pressing down on him like a boulder. The reality of being labeled a suspect was hitting him hard. Linda seethed, pacing back and forth across the living room. Her face was red with anger.
This is ridiculous. They have no evidence, no proof. Just her word against yours.
Jaden looked up, his eyes filled with worry and sadness.
Mom, what if people believe her? I'm just the kid who tried to help, but everyone thinks I'm some kind of thief now.
The thought of people seeing him as a criminal made his chest tighten painfully. Linda sighed, sitting beside him. She wrapped an arm around his shoulders, pulling him into a comforting hug.
We're going to get through this, Jaden. We'll clear your name. I'll find a lawyer if I have to.
But as the days passed, things only grew worse. Word had spread quickly around their neighborhood. Mrs. Fields had shared her version of events with a few neighbors, and soon the whispers turned into gossip that spread like wildfire. People began giving Jaden strange looks whenever he was outside, as if he were a stranger they no longer trusted. A few neighbors even crossed the street to avoid him. One afternoon, he saw his friend Marcus on his way home from school. Usually, Marcus would call out to him or wave, but today he hesitated, his usual smile replaced by an uncertain expression.
Hey, I heard about what happened. Is it true? Did you take her stuff?
Marcus said, his voice filled with awkwardness. The question stung. Jaden looked at Marcus, hurt flooding his eyes.
Marcus, I would never. You know me,
he said, his voice thick with frustration and betrayal. Marcus looked away, scratching the back of his neck.
Yeah, but Mrs. Fields, she's an old lady, Jaden. Why would she lie?
Jaden's heart sank, his voice heavy with sadness.
I don't know, Marcus. Maybe she's confused. I swear I didn't do anything wrong.
Marcus shuffled uncomfortably, muttering a quick goodbye before hurrying off. Jaden watched him walk away, feeling the ache of betrayal settle deep in his chest. Even his closest friends were beginning to doubt him. As days passed, the situation spiraled even further. Jaden's family began receiving anonymous notes shoved under their door, each one filled with hateful words. The insults were scrawled messily, but the intent was clear. Thief, criminal, watch your back. It seemed like the entire neighborhood had turned against him overnight, judging him based on accusations he couldn't even prove wrong. The once familiar streets felt hostile, and the weight of suspicion bore down on him relentlessly. One evening, Linda received a phone call from the police station. Her face grew tense as she listened, nodding occasionally before hanging up.
Mom?
Jaden asked, worry creeping into his voice. Linda let out a deep breath, a look of both anger and helplessness flashing across her face.
They've found fingerprints. On a few pieces of Mrs. Fields' furniture, they match yours,
she explained, her voice trembling slightly. Jaden's eyes widened.
Of course they do. I was there helping her with the TV. That's no proof of theft.
Linda nodded, her jaw clenched tightly.
Exactly. But the police are treating it like some kind of evidence. And Mrs. Fields is still insisting that you had something to do with it.
The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. No matter what they said or did, it seemed as though the entire world was convinced Jaden was guilty. Every piece of innocent evidence was being twisted into something sinister, and it felt like an inescapable nightmare. That night, as Jaden lay in bed, He stared at the ceiling, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and frustration bubbling inside him. How could things have gone so wrong so quickly? All he'd wanted to do was help. A soft tap on his window pulled him from his thoughts. Startled, he sat up, his heart racing. He saw a shadow outside the window, moving cautiously. Cautiously, he got out of bed and opened the window just a crack.
Psst, Jaden, it's me, Marcus.
A voice whispered. Relieved but confused, Jaden opened the window wider, allowing Marcus to slip inside.
What are you doing here?
Jaden asked, his voice a mix of surprise and wariness. Marcus looked around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. He whispered urgently,
I know what they're saying isn't true. I talked to someone who might know something about what happened, and I think Mrs. Fields might not be as innocent as everyone thinks.
Jaden's confusion grew, his mind racing with questions.
What do you mean?
Marcus shook his head.
I can't explain now. Meet me tomorrow night by the park. I'll tell you everything then.
Though his mind spun with curiosity and anxiety, Jaden nodded, grateful for even a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Marcus knew something that could help clear his name. The next evening, Jaden slipped out of his house under the cover of darkness, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Marcus was waiting for him at the edge of the park, glancing around nervously as if they were about to do something illegal.
Marcus, what's going on?
Jaden's voice a low whisper. Marcus leaned in, his voice barely audible.
I found out something strange. My uncle is a handyman in this neighborhood, and he's been to Mrs. Fields' house a couple of times. He said she has a really expensive collection of old jewelry, and she's paranoid about people stealing it.
Jaden's brows furrowed.
Paranoid? But she let me in to help with the TV. Why would she do that if she didn't trust me?
Marcus hesitated before continuing.
Uncle Rob told me that Mrs. Fields has a habit of accusing people. This isn't the first time. She's even accused 3 or 4 other people of stealing from her before.
Jaden felt a jolt of realization.
So, she just accuses people?
He asked, a mixture of hope and disbelief in his voice. Marcus shook his head.
Not exactly. Uncle Rob said she's obsessed with her valuables. She even has secret cameras all over her house. He installed a new one for her a few months ago.
Jaden's mouth fell open. Cameras? He hadn't noticed any during his visit, but if Mrs. Fields had cameras, maybe, just maybe, there was footage that could prove he was innocent. Jaden's eyes lit up with hope.
If she has cameras, then there might be footage of me that night. Where does she keep the footage?
Marcus shrugged, looking apologetic.
That's the thing. I don't know. But Rob said she's really secretive about it. She might keep it in a safe or something.
Jaden's mind raced. If he could somehow get to the footage, he could prove once and for all that he hadn't done anything wrong. But with the entire neighborhood against him, getting access to Mrs. Fields' home seemed impossible. The following day, Jaden made a decision. He couldn't sit back any longer. After school, he approached Mrs. Fields' house, ignoring the suspicious glances from neighbors nearby. Summoning his courage, he rang the doorbell, hoping Mrs. Fields would at least let him explain. When Mrs. Fields opened the door, she looked at him with an expression that was equal parts fear and suspicion.
Jaden, why are you here?
She asked, her voice trembling slightly.
Mrs. Fields, I just want to talk.
Jaden said, his tone pleading.
Please, you know I didn't take anything. I came to help, that's all.
For a brief moment, Mrs. Fields' face softened, but the cautious look in her eyes remained.
I know what I saw, Jaden. My things were gone after you left. I've been warned about people like you.
Jaden felt a sharp sting at her words, but he pushed down the hurt, trying to remain calm.
People like me?
He asked, struggling to keep the hurt out of his voice.
Mrs. Fields, I only wanted to help you. If you think I did something, maybe you can check the cameras. Isn't there footage of me from that night?
At his question, Mrs. Fields' eyes flickered with something, panic, just for a second before she quickly looked away.
You don't need to worry about what I have or don't have in my house. The police have everything they need.
And with that, she closed the door firmly in his face. Jaden stood there, heart sinking, realizing that Mrs. Fields had no intention of helping him prove his innocence. Determined not to give up, Jaden shared his encounter with Mrs. Fields with Marcus later that evening. They met at the edge of the park, hidden from view, both of them glancing around as if someone might overhear their conversation.
Listen, Jaden.
Marcus whispered, his voice urgent.
If Mrs. Fields has the footage, it's probably on a memory card or something. We just need to get in there and grab it.
Jaden's eyes widened as he processed Marcus's words.
You're saying we break in?
Marcus nodded, his face set with determination.
It's not really breaking in if it's just to get the proof you need. You've got nothing else to clear your name. We'll go at night when she's asleep, just to grab the footage, then we leave.
Jaden hesitated, fear mixing with a spark of hope. He knew the risks, but he couldn't see any other way to prove his innocence. After a long, tense silence, he nodded.
Fine, but we have to be careful. No one can know.
Later that night, Jaden and Marcus crept through the neighborhood under cover of darkness, their faces hidden beneath dark hoodies. The quiet streets felt eerie, every sound magnified in the tense silence. Jaden's hands shook as they approached Mrs. Fields' side window, which Marcus had managed to pry open earlier. Marcus looked over at him, giving a small nod.
Ready?
Jaden swallowed hard, his heart pounding as he nodded back, though his mind was racing with nerves. He slowly climbed through the window, landing softly on the floor inside. Marcus followed close behind, both boys holding their breath. Inside, the house was silent, dimly lit only by the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. Jaden used his phone's flashlight sparingly, guiding them through the living room and towards Mrs. Fields' study, where they guessed she might keep the footage. They searched carefully, trying to be as quiet as possible. After what felt like an eternity, Marcus finally found a small drawer in a side cabinet, packed with memory cards labeled by date.
This is it.
Marcus whispered excitedly, holding up a card with the date from the night Jaden had visited Mrs. Fields. Jaden's heart leapt with relief.
Let's go,
he whispered back, stuffing the card into his pocket. But just as they turned to leave, a light flickered on in the hallway.
Who's there?
Mrs. Fields' voice rang out, filled with alarm. Jaden froze, his mind racing. They'd been caught. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, and before they knew it, Mrs. Fields was standing before them, her face filled with shock and fury.
Jaden, what are you doing in my house?
She demanded, her voice shaking with anger. Jaden took a step forward, raising his hands.
Mrs. Fields, I'm sorry. I just wanted to prove I didn't take anything. You have cameras, and if you check the footage, you'll see I didn't steal from you.
Mrs. Fields' face twisted with anger and disbelief.
You break into my house to prove your innocence. You really think anyone will believe that?
At that moment, the unmistakable sound of police sirens approached, the flashing lights visible through the blinds. Jaden's stomach dropped. Mrs. Fields must have already called them. Jaden and Marcus were taken to the police station in silence, their hands cuffed behind their backs. The weight of the situation was overwhelming, and Jaden's mind raced with worry. When they arrived, his mother, Linda, was already there, her face pale with fear and anger.
What's happening? Why are you holding my son?
Linda demanded as the officers led Jaden and Marcus inside. One officer spoke up, his tone formal and unyielding.
Ma'am, Jaden and his friend were caught inside Mrs. Fields' home without permission. This is a serious offense.
Linda's face flushed with anger.
He's innocent,
she insisted, her voice shaking with frustration.
Mrs. Fields has footage of him. She's the one refusing to show it.
Jaden looked up, his eyes pleading.
Please, just check the footage. If you look at it, you'll see I didn't take anything.
The officers exchanged a look, and after a moment of hesitation, they agreed to contact Mrs. Fields and obtain the memory card. They inserted it into a laptop, and everyone in the room watched in tense silence as the footage began to play. Jaden and Linda held their breath. The footage showed Jaden entering Mrs. Fields' house, just as he had described. He went straight to the television and began working on it, focused on the task. At no point did he go anywhere near Mrs. Fields' valuables. The officers glanced at each other, their expressions changing as they watched. Then something else caught their eye. Just as Jaden was leaving, the footage captured another person slipping into Mrs. Fields' home through the side door, a shadowy figure wearing a hood. The officers rewound the footage, pausing to get a closer look at the figure. For a brief moment, the person's face was visible, and it was enough.
That's your son, Mrs. Fields,
one officer said, stunned, as he turned to face her. Mrs. Fields paled, her hands shaking as she stammered.
I don't know what you're talking about.
But the truth was now undeniable. The man on the footage was her son, who had a history of drug issues and theft. It turned out he had been stealing from her for years without her realizing it. In her confusion and fear, she had blamed Jaden, the kind boy who had only tried to help. With the truth exposed, Jaden was finally cleared of all suspicion, and Mrs. Fields' son was taken into custody. The neighborhood buzzed with the shocking revelation, and many of the neighbors who had shunned Jaden now approached him with apologies, expressing regret for their quick judgment. But while Jaden was relieved, the experience left a mark on him. Though he'd been vindicated, he couldn't shake the sting of how quickly people had turned against him. Friends, neighbors, even strangers had all been ready to believe the worst, without even giving him a chance. One evening, as he sat with his mom, Linda looked at him, her expression filled with both pride and sadness.
I'm so proud of you, Jaden. You never gave up, even when it felt like the whole world was against you,
she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. Jaden nodded, thoughtful.
I just wish they'd seen me for who I really am instead of assuming the worst,
he murmured, his voice tinged with sadness. Linda wrapped her arm around him, pulling him close.
You showed everyone the truth, and that's what matters.
The experience had left Jaden stronger, but it had also opened his eyes to how quickly people could judge others, especially those who didn't fit their expectations. It was a hard lesson, but one he promised himself he would remember. And from that day on, he vowed to treat others with kindness and understanding, no matter what the world might assume about them.